The first thing I want you to understand is the silence. For 30 years, my life was a symphony of managed sound. The soft click of a closing door, the discreet murmur of a phone call, the rustle of a newspaper folded just so. I was Frank, the company butler, a title Mr. Alistair Sterling had invented for me on my first day. It was his little joke, but it stuck, because it was true. I didn't just manage his schedule or his country estate. I managed his life, his privacy, his secrets. I was the curator of his magnificent reclusive world. The silence I knew was the sound of a well-oiled machine, the peace that comes when every gear is turning in perfect silent harmony. The new silence, the one that greeted me as I sat in my car outside the grand iron gates for the last time, was different. This was the silence of a vacuum, the silence of erasure. Everett Sterling, Alistair's only son and heir, had delivered the news himself, which I suppose was a mark of some kind of respect, albeit the kind a butcher shows a prize steer just before the bolt gun. He'd summoned me to the study, Alistair's sanctuary. The room smelled wrong. Everett had been smoking a thin, arrogant-looking cigar, and the acrid smell clung to the ancient leather and old paper, a foul cologne on a venerable old man. He didn't ask me to sit. He stood behind his father's desk, though he looked less like an heir and more like a child playing dress-up in his father's oversized suit. He said, "Frank, as you know, we're entering a new era for Sterling Consolidated. We're streamlining. We're modernizing. We're unlocking shareholder value." He spoke in a series of pre-packaged phrases he'd likely learned in a business school seminar on hostile takeovers. He looked at me, a man who had known him since he was a pouting toddler in a sailor suit, and he saw nothing but a legacy cost, an expenditure. "Your services, while appreciated in their time," he'd said, pausing to find the right condescending word, "are no longer required." Just like that. 30 years, a lifetime of loyalty, of anticipating every need, of guarding the Sterling family name with more ferocity than any security team. All of it bundled up and tossed aside with the casual indifference of a man throwing out yesterday's newspaper. He pushed a thin envelope across the mahogany desk, a severance package he called it, the standard 2 weeks. For 30 years of service, it was so insulting it was almost comical. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach, a familiar sensation I'd felt countless times over the years, usually when shielding Alistair from some impending disaster or foolishness from the outside world. But this time, the disaster was inside the gates. I didn't touch the envelope, I just looked at him. I think my stillness unnerved him. He was expecting me to plead, to protest, to show some kind of messy, undignified emotion. I did none of that. I simply held his gaze. I had learned from the master Alistair that true power is often found in silence, in letting the other person's bluster fill the room until it suffocates them. Everett shifted his weight, the leather of Alistair's chair groaning in protest. He gestured vaguely around the room. "We're liquidating all non-essential assets, the properties, the art collection, all of it. Sentimentality is a poor investment strategy, Frank. We need to be lean, agile." He pointed with his cigar at the wall to my left, including that monstrosity. My eyes followed his gesture to the painting. It had hung on that wall for 50 years. A huge abstract canvas, a chaotic storm of deep blues, angry reds, and a single defiant slash of gold. To the untrained eye, it was a mess. A jumble of color with no discernible form. Everett saw it as worthless. Alistair's one lapse in taste. He had no idea what he was looking at. He had no idea that he wasn't looking at a painting, but at a lock. And I, the man he was so casually discarding, was the only living person who held the key. That painting was the silent guardian of a hidden safe, and inside that safe was the one thing that could bring Everett's entire world crashing down. The only copy of the company's original charter. A document that granted a 50% ownership stake to the family of his father's forgotten partner. "My family." I gave a slight formal nod. "I understand," I said. My voice was even, betraying nothing. I turned and walked out of the study, leaving the envelope on the desk. I walked down the long, familiar hallway, my footsteps echoing in a way they never had before. It felt like walking out of my own life. As I passed through the grand foyer, I caught my reflection in one of the gilded mirrors. I looked older than I had that morning, a ghost in a house that was no longer my home. And now, sitting in my car, the engine off, the silence was deafening. It was the end of an era, but as I finally turned the key in the ignition and pulled away from the curb, a different thought began to form, quiet but persistent. Everett thought he was starting a new era. He thought he was closing a book. He had no idea he had just handed me the pen and invited me to write the final chapter. And I've always been a man who believes in finishing what was started. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about a debt. And some debts are paid in ink. I knew then that I wouldn't just be a spectator to the liquidation of Alistair Sterling's legacy. I was going to be the one holding the auctioneer's gavel. Now, if you've ever been cast aside by a company you gave your life to, if you've ever felt like a ghost in the halls you helped build, then you know a little of what I was feeling. Do me a favor, hit that like button and subscribe. You're going to want to see how this plays out. The drive home was a journey through a landscape that seemed both familiar and alien. For 3 decades, this 15-mile stretch of winding country road was the buffer between my two lives, the meticulously ordered universe of the Sterling estate and the quiet, humble reality of my own home. Usually it was a time for decompression, for shedding the mantle of the company butler and becoming just Frank Thorne again. But on this day the road felt endless, and the transition felt impossible. Who was I if not Alistair Sterling's right hand? My identity had been so completely interwoven with my role that being fired felt less like losing a job and more like a fundamental amputation of self. I pulled into the gravel driveway of my small but well-kept house, a world away from the manicured lawns and towering stone walls I had just left. The chrysanthemums my wife Eleanor had planted in the spring were in full defiant bloom, a riot of bronze and yellow against the crisp autumn air. The sight of them, so ordinary and so beautiful, was almost too much to bear. I switched off the engine and just sat there, the silence in the car now replaced by the gentle rustling of leaves. It was the sound of a world that was moving on without me. Inside, the house was quiet. Eleanor was at her part-time job at the local library. I was grateful for the solitude. I walked into my own small study, a room filled not with priceless antiques and first editions, but with paperback novels, family photos, and the comfortable clutter of a life lived, not curated. I poured myself a glass of water, my hand shaking slightly. I'm not a drinking man, not in the way Alistair had been with his nightly ritual of vintage scotch. My own vice was routine, a predictable order that had just been violently upended. The cold water did little to quell the fire in my gut. I sank into my worn leather armchair, the one with the permanent impression of my form, and let the full weight of what had happened wash over me. 30 years. I started when I was 25, a young man with a strong back and a quiet disposition, hired initially as a junior groundskeeper. Alistair had spotted something in me. Not ambition, but diligence. A capacity for discretion. He'd promoted me, trained me, and eventually entrusted me with everything. I managed household staff, oversaw security protocols, vetted business contacts, arranged travel to the 4 corners of the globe, and most importantly, I kept the secrets. I knew which politicians owed him favors, which corporate rivals had skeletons in their closets, and which of his philanthropic endeavors were genuine versus those that were strategic chess moves on a global board. My loyalty was absolute, because it wasn't just to a man, it was to the memory of another. My gaze fell upon a framed photograph on my desk. It was old, black and white, the corners soft with age. 2 young men in shirt sleeves, grinning, standing in front of a small, dusty workshop. One was a young, sharp-featured Alistair Sterling, radiating a hungry ambition. The other, with a thoughtful smile and kind eyes, was my father, Thomas Thorne. They had started it all, Sterling and Thorne. That was the original name, before Alistair, ever the pragmatist, shortened it after my father's death. My father was the genius, the inventor. He was the one who developed the revolutionary alloy processes that became the bedrock of the company's fortune. Alistair was the salesman, the visionary who saw the market and knew how to conquer it. They were a perfect team, built on a handshake and a shared dream. They were more than partners, they were brothers. Then a heart attack at 42, sudden, devastating. My father was gone, I was only 10. We were left with nothing. My mother, heartbroken and overwhelmed, had no understanding of business. Alistair came to the funeral, of course. He'd squeezed my mother's hand, his eyes full of what I now recognized as a complex cocktail of genuine grief and strategic calculation. He'd promised to take care of us. And in his own way he did. He set up a modest trust for my education and offered my mother a pension. It was generous by any normal standard, but it was a pittance compared to the fortune my father's work was generating. The name Thorne was quietly dropped from the letterhead, the history rewritten to feature a single brilliant founder. When I came of age, Alistair offered me a job. It felt like a continuation of his promise, a way to keep a thorn within the orbit of the Sterling Empire. At the time, I saw it as an act of profound kindness. I resolved to repay him with a lifetime of unwavering loyalty. I would be the thorn who stayed, the one who served, to honor the memory of the one who had built. For 30 years, I held up my end of that bargain. I buried my own ambitions and dedicated myself to his. I had become a fixture, a piece of the estate's architecture, and as Everett had so brutally demonstrated, old architecture gets torn down to make way for glass and steel. The memory that truly cemented my course of action, however, was from about 5 years ago. Alistair was already frail, his brilliant mind beginning to wander, but there were moments of startling clarity. He'd called me into the study one evening. The room was dark, save for a single lamp that cast a golden glow on the very abstract painting Everett now called a monstrosity. He didn't look at me. He stared at the canvas. "Do you see it, Frank?" he'd rasped, his voice thin as parchment. I looked at the chaotic swirl of colors. "See what, sir?" "The balance," he said. "Everyone thinks it's just noise. My son, Everett, he sees noise. He sees a bad investment. He doesn't see the foundation." He pointed a trembling finger at the single, defiant slash of gold that cut through the chaos. "That's your father, Frank. That's the thorn line. The one pure element that makes the whole chaotic mess hold together. Without it, it's just mud." My heart had hammered in my chest. He'd never spoken of my father so directly. He went on, his voice a low conspiracy. "My boy is a fool, a greedy, short-sighted fool. He'll inherit the money, but he won't understand the wealth. The wealth, Frank, is in the foundations, in the partnerships, in debts of honor." He finally turned to me, his eyes boring into mine, with an intensity I hadn't seen in years. "When I'm gone, he will try to erase the past. He'll try to erase you. He will try to sell this painting for a few $1,000s thinking he's clever." He instructed me to come closer. He showed me a spot on the canvas, a thick daub of crimson paint that was almost invisible in the swirl of red. "You press here," he whispered, guiding my finger to it. "Hard, then you turn the top right corner of the frame, just a quarter turn, counterclockwise." He made me promise to remember. "Inside," he said, "is the beginning, the key to the real charter. The one that honors the handshake, not just the lawyer's loopholes." He made me swear an oath. I wasn't to act unless his legacy of partnership was truly threatened. "Protect the foundation, Frank," he had commanded. "That is your final duty to me. Not to my son. To me." At the time, it felt like the ramblings of a dying man, a piece of sentimental theater. I'd honored his wish, tucking the knowledge away, never truly believing I would need it. I was loyal to Alistair, and I believed that loyalty extended to his heir, however flawed. Everett's crass dismissal, his plan to sell the very symbol of my family's contribution, had changed everything. He wasn't just firing an employee, he was desecrating a tomb. He was breaking the one promise Alistair had charged me to protect. The final piece of the puzzle slotted into place, as I remembered a much earlier encounter. Everett, home from university for a holiday, swaggering around the estate as if he already owned it. He'd cornered me in the pantry, angry that his favorite brand of imported water wasn't stocked. He'd sneered at me. "You're just the help, Frank. Remember that. When I'm in charge, all of my father's sentimental attachments are going out with the trash." I had held my tongue then, absorbing the insult as part of the job, but I never forgot. Competence isn't cheap until you lose it. Everett was about to learn that lesson in the most expensive way imaginable. The phone rang, jolting me from my reverie. It was Eleanor. "Frank, are you home? Is everything all right?" Her voice, calm and steady, was the anchor I needed. "I'm home, Elle. Everything is changing." When she arrived an hour later, I told her everything. The firing, the insult of the severance, Everett's plans, and finally, the story of the painting. She listened patiently, her expression unreadable. When I finished, she came over and took my hand. Her touch was warm, firm. "Alistair Sterling was a complicated man," she said softly, "but he was no fool. He didn't trust his own son to protect what he built. He trusted you." She looked over at the photo of my father. "For 30 years, you've honored Alistair's loyalty to you. Maybe it's time to honor his loyalty to your father." That was it. The catalyst, the quiet permission I needed to shift from victim to strategist. My loyalty to Alistair Sterling wasn't a contract of servitude to his bloodline. It was a sacred pact to protect his true legacy, the foundation, and Everett Sterling had just declared war on that foundation. The quiet resolve that settled over me was cold, hard, and absolute. The company butler was retired. Frank Thorne, son of Thomas Thorne, was about to report for duty. The first step in any campaign is to understand the terrain and secure your lines of supply. My terrain was a battlefield of corporate law, estate liquidation, and hidden history. My line of supply had to be information and expertise. Before I did anything else, before I even allowed myself to dream of the end game, I picked up the phone. I didn't call an employment lawyer to grovel for a better severance. I called the one man I knew who understood the Sterling Empire as well as I did, but from the inside of its legal labyrinth. Arthur Vance had been the Sterling family's personal lawyer for 40 years. He was a man of the old school, where a lawyer's duty was not just to the letter of the law, but to the spirit of his client's intent. He was discreet, brilliant, and possessed a memory for contractual details that was nothing short of encyclopedic. Everett, in his infinite wisdom, had streamlined him into retirement 2 months prior, replacing his decades of experience with a slick downtown firm, whose partners were younger than Arthur's tailored suits. It was a colossal blunder, and I was about to turn it into my primary weapon. I reached him at his home. "Arthur," I said, my voice low, "it's Frank Thorne. I find myself, like you, enjoying an unanticipated retirement." There was a pause on the line, then a dry chuckle. "Frank, I was wondering when I'd get this call. Let me guess. The young emperor has finally decided your brand of loyalty is an outdated commodity." "You could say that," I replied. "I was hoping I might buy you lunch. I have a matter of historical significance to discuss." "My calendar has been gloriously open," he said. "The old university club, tomorrow, 1 o'clock. Their clam chowder is still blessedly free of any modernizing influences." The university club was a relic of a bygone era, all dark wood, worn leather, and hushed tones. It was the perfect place for a conspiracy. Arthur was already there when I arrived, seated in a secluded booth, a glass of iced tea in front of him. He was a small bird-like man with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. He had lost the stoop of a corporate lawyer and seemed to stand taller in retirement. "Frank," he greeted me, shaking my hand firmly, "you look purposeful." "I have a purpose, Arthur," I said, sliding into the booth. I didn't waste time with small talk. I laid it all out. The firing, Everett's contemptuous attitude, his rush to liquidate everything, and his specific mention of the ugly abstract painting. I watched Arthur's face as I spoke. He nodded along, his expression one of grim, unsurprised validation. But when I began to recount Alistair's story about the painting, the secret of the frame, and the promise he'd extracted from me, Arthur leaned forward, his iced tea forgotten. His eyes, which had been placid, now held a glint of pure predatory excitement. When I finished, he was silent for a full minute, tapping a long finger on the white tablecloth. "Sterling and Thorne," he finally whispered, more to himself than to me. "My God, Alistair, you magnificent crazy old bastard. You actually did it. You knew.
I asked, surprised. No, not for certain, he said, taking a sip of tea. But I suspected. I handled your father's estate matters after he passed. Alistair was insistent on certain phrasing in the final documents. Vague clauses about unsettled partnership accounts and founding equities to be addressed at a future date. My predecessor thought it was sentimental nonsense. Alistair paid a hefty fee to keep that nonsense in the corporate record. It was a loose thread. I never knew what it was attached to, until now. He looked me straight in the eye. Frank, this changes everything. This isn't a wrongful termination suit. This is a claim of ownership. If that charter exists, and is as you describe it, Everett doesn't own 100% of a company. He owns 50, and you, as your father's sole heir, own the other 50.
The words hung in the air between us, immense and terrifying and wonderful. 50%. It was a number so large it was difficult to comprehend. But can we prove it? I asked. It's been over 50 years. Everett will fight it with everything he has. He'll call it a forgery, a fantasy. A slow, wolfish grin spread across Arthur's face. Let him, he said with relish. Alistair was eccentric, but he was legally meticulous. If he created this document, he would have had it notarized, witnessed, and sealed in a way that is legally unassailable. Our challenge isn't proving its validity. Our challenge is getting our hands on it. And so, in the quiet wood-paneled dining room of the University Club, the War Council began. For the next 3 hours, over bowls of chowder and plates of roast beef, we mapped out the strategy. It was a multi-stage operation, requiring patience, precision, and capital. First, the painting. We cannot, under any circumstances, let Everett know its value to us, Arthur stated, wagging a finger. He sees it as junk. We must encourage that perception. We need to acquire it legally and discreetly. Everett, being the cost-cutter he was, would almost certainly use a regional auction house rather than a premier one like Sotheby's or Christie's to offload the estate's lesser pieces. Arthur's contacts in the art and legal worlds were unparalleled. He made a quiet call right there from the table. Within 10 minutes, he had the name of the auction house Everett's team had contracted. The auction was in 3 weeks. Now the acquisition, Arthur continued, hanging up the phone. We can't bid ourselves. The names Thorne or Vance would set off every alarm bell. We need a proxy, a cutout. He thought for a moment. I know a woman, an art consultant named Isabel Reed, fiercely discreet. I helped her out of a rather nasty contractual dispute a few years ago. She owes me a favor. We will set up a shell corporation, something anodyne, like Mid-Century Holdings LLC. She will bid on our behalf. Then came the question of money. These things can be unpredictable, Frank, Arthur warned. What if a real art lover shows up? What if someone else sees something in it? We need to be prepared to bid a significant amount. An amount that might seem foolish for what the painting appears to be. This was a part of the plan I had already considered. I wasn't a poor man. Alistair had compensated me well, and Eleanor and I had lived modestly, investing wisely. I had a substantial nest egg. I looked Arthur in the eye. I've spent my life managing Alistair Sterling's assets, I said. It's time I invested in my own. I'll liquidate what's necessary. This isn't an expense, Arthur. It's the purchase price for my family's legacy. I saw a flicker of deep respect in his eyes. Our plan grew more detailed. Arthur would draft the paperwork for the shell company. I would wire the funds. Isabel would be briefed, but Arthur added another layer. We need intelligence, he said. While you were the keeper of Alistair's secrets, I was the architect of his legal fortifications. I still have friends, old clerks, junior partners who resent the new regime, inside Sterling Consolidated and at the new law firm. I can make some calls, get a sense of Everett's financial position, his timeline. Knowledge is leverage. He also stressed the importance of the charter's contents beyond the ownership stake. You mentioned Alistair spoke of founding principles, a moral compass, Arthur recalled. If that's in the charter, it could be our trump card. It could give us legal grounds to challenge Everett's entire business strategy, to argue he is violating the core tenets of the company he claims to lead. It elevates our claim from a mere money grab to a mission to save the company's soul. The board, the banks, they will respond to that. Over the next 2 weeks, our secret plan took shape with the precision of a military operation. Arthur, rejuvenated by the fight, worked with a quiet fury. He set up the LLC. He met with Isabel Reed, who, true to his word, was the soul of discretion, and intrigued by the mystery of it all. I in turn went to my bank and arranged the transfer of a significant portion of my life's savings into the new corporate account. It was the single biggest risk I had ever taken, but it felt less like a gamble and more like an inevitability. Every step felt preordained, a path laid out for me by Alistair decades ago. Arthur's intelligence network began to bear fruit. He learned from a disgruntled source at Everett's new law firm that Sterling Consolidated was more leveraged than anyone knew. Alistair had always maintained vast cash reserves, a philosophy Everett saw as inefficient. Everett had taken on significant debt to fund a disastrously ill-advised venture into speculative tech, a venture that was now hemorrhaging money. The liquidation wasn't just about streamlining, it was a desperate, panicked scramble for cash. He wasn't just selling his father's legacy, he was trying to plug a hole in a sinking ship. This piece of information was golden. It meant Everett was under pressure. He would be focused on the big-ticket items, the real estate, the blue-chip stocks. A dusty old painting would be a footnote, an afterthought. His greed and his desperation were creating the very blind spot we needed to exploit. The day before the auction, Arthur and I had our final pre-op meeting. We sat in his study, surrounded by leather-bound law books. On the table between us was a simple speakerphone. "Isabel, are you ready?" Arthur asked. Her voice came through, crisp and professional. "The account is funded. I have the auction catalog. Lot 347. Untitled abstract, artist unknown. It's scheduled for the late afternoon session, usually when the lower value items are moved. The estimate is, as we hoped, insultingly low. Any unexpected interest?" I asked, my own voice tight with tension. "None that I can detect," she replied. "The art world is small. If there were whispers about this piece, I would have heard them. To everyone but us, it's just a large, unattractive piece of mid-century canvas." "Excellent," Arthur said. "Our ceiling is set. Do not exceed it unless I give a direct verbal command. Frank and I will be with you on this line for the entire duration of the bidding. Stick to the plan. Be boring. Be just another dealer picking up inventory." "Understood," she replied. "See you on the battlefield." She disconnected. Arthur leaned back in his chair. "Well, Frank," he said, a faint smile on his lips, "tomorrow we go fishing. Let's hope the sharks are busy chasing bigger prey." I nodded, my heart a steady rhythmic drum. The silence of my new life was gone. It had been replaced by the hum of a meticulously planned, long overdue reckoning. The day of the auction was gray and overcast, the sky the color of old pewter. It suited my mood perfectly. I wasn't nervous, I was coiled, a spring wound tight over 30 years now ready to be released. I was at Arthur's house, in his study. The room felt like a command center. A speakerphone sat in the middle of his large mahogany desk, a silent oracle waiting to connect us to our proxy, Isabel. Arthur, ever the stoic, poured us both glasses of water. He knew me well enough not to offer anything stronger. My mind needed to be a razor's edge. The auction began at 2 o'clock. We listened as the early lots, silverware, minor sculptures, antique furniture, were sold off. The auctioneer's voice was a smooth hypnotic drone, a river of numbers and names flowing past us. It was all background noise. We were waiting for a single lot, number 347. At 4:15, it came. "And now, ladies and gentlemen, we have lot number 347, the auctioneer announced, his tone shifting to one of brisk efficiency, the kind reserved for items you just want to get through. "This is a very large-scale abstract oil on canvas, untitled. We have no provenance, but it is certainly of the period. A very decorative piece for a large wall. Let's start the bidding at $500. Do I have 500? Silence. My stomach tightened. $500 for the key to a billion-dollar empire. The absurdity was breathtaking. $500 anywhere,
The auctioneer prodded. Isabel's voice, calm and detached, came through our speakerphone in a whisper. I'm going in. A disembodied voice from the auction floor said, yes, I have $500 from the phone. The auctioneer acknowledged. Do I hear 750? 750? Yes. Another voice, a paddle in the room. 750 is bid. Looking for 1,000. Isabel whispered to us, standard procedure. He's bidding against a floor bidder. Just getting it started. She calmly placed her bid. 1,000. 1,000 on the phone. Do I have 1,250? Yes. It was the same paddle in the room. A local dealer probably, thinking he could get it cheap and flip it for a small profit. The bidding continued in this predictable pattern. 1,500, 2,000, 2,500. The paddle in the room stayed in, but Isabel, following our instructions, was relentless. Her bids immediate and confident. At $5,000, the room bidder dropped out. Sold then, for $5,000 to our bidder on the phone, the auctioneer said, his gavel raised. My heart leaped. Arthur gave me a small tight smile. We had it. It was that easy. But then, a new voice cut through the room. 10,000. The auctioneer paused, his gavel hovering. I have a new bid. $10,000 from the gentleman in the back. Isabel's whisper was sharp. New player, unidentified. I don't recognize him. Arthur leaned into the phone. Stay calm, Isabel. Follow the plan. Our ceiling is high. Let's see if he's serious. 15,000. Isabel bid, her voice still a model of professional indifference. 20,000. The voice from the back shot back immediately. A knot of ice formed in my gut. This wasn't a casual bidder. This was someone with intent. Someone who, like us, was prepared to pay far more than the painting was supposedly worth. Who else could possibly know? Had Alistair told someone else? Had Everett, in his arrogance, bragged about it, not knowing what he was revealing? 25,000, Isabel said, her voice a fraction tighter. 30,000. Who is it? I hissed into the phone. I'm trying to see, Isabel whispered back. He's standing in the shadows by the exit, well dressed. He's on his own phone, getting instructions. Arthur's face was a stone mask, but his eyes were blazing. Keep going, Isabel. Don't let him think he's scared us off. 35,000. 40. 50. The numbers were escalating at a terrifying pace. The rest of the auction room was now silent, watching this unexpected drama unfold over a piece of junk. We were flying past the absurd and into the realm of the insane. We were approaching the limit of the funds I had allocated. 75,000. The man in the back bit. Isabel, I said, my throat dry. That's our limit. Arthur, she asked, looking for the final command. Arthur was staring into space, his mind working furiously. What did my source say about Everett's finances? He mused aloud, desperate, scrambling for cash. Why would he have someone bidding up the price of his own painting? It makes no sense. Unless, his eyes snapped back into focus, unless he's not bidding to buy, he's bidding to sell. It's a shill bidder. He's trying to drive up the price, to squeeze every last drop out of a sale he thinks is the genuine, foolishly enthusiastic buyer. It was a classic, if slightly illegal, auction tactic. Everett, too greedy to just take the money, was trying to fleece the fool who wanted his father's ugly painting. He had no idea the fool was a proxy for the man he had just fired. He's playing poker, Frank, Arthur said, his voice hard, and he's bluffing. He can't afford to be the one left holding the painting. He needs the cash. He leaned into the phone. Isabel, one more bid. $100,000. Say it like you're bored. My blood ran cold. It was a massive leap, a huge risk. Arthur, trust me, Frank, we're calling his bluff. Isabel took a deep breath. I could hear it through the phone. Then her voice, dripping with theatrical ennui, cut through the auction room. 100,000.
The silence that followed was absolute. All eyes turned to the man in the back. He was talking frantically into his phone. He looked panicked. The auctioneer, sensing the kill, turned his attention to him. Sir? $100,000 is the bid. Are you in or out? The man shook his head, lowered his phone and melted back into the shadows. He was out. $100,000 going once, twice. Sold. The gavel crashed down, the sound echoing like a cannon shot in the silent room. To our bidder on the phone. I slumped back in my chair. the tension draining out of me in a rush. I felt dizzy. Arthur let out a long, slow breath and patted my shoulder. "Well done, Frank," he said. "You just bought your company back. Everett Sterling is so clever. He just cost himself a fortune to make an extra $25,000. The next day, the painting was delivered. It arrived in a large, unmarked van, handled by professional art movers. They brought it into my living room, and when they unwrapped it, it seemed to dominate the entire space. It was bigger and more chaotic than I remembered. After they left, I stood before it for a long time, just looking. It felt like coming face to face with my own destiny. My hand was trembling as I reached out to the spot Alistair had shown me, the thick daub of crimson paint. I pressed, just as he'd instructed. For a moment, nothing happened. My heart sank. Had it all been a fantasy, a dying man's confused dream? I pressed harder, putting my weight into it. I felt a faint, deep click, a sound that seemed to come from the very bones of the canvas. Then, following his second instruction, I moved to the top right corner of the massive frame. It was heavy, solid oak. I gripped it and turned, counterclockwise. It resisted, then gave way with a soft groan of old wood. As I completed the quarter turn, a section of the frame on the side swung open on a hidden hinge, revealing a small hollow compartment. My breath caught in my throat. It was real. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, were two objects, not the charter itself, but something far more personal. The first was a small, heavy, ornate brass key. The second was a slim, leather-bound journal. I lifted the journal out. The leather was worn smooth with time. I opened it. The inside cover had a single sentence, written in Alistair Sterling's familiar, spiky handwriting. Alistair Sterling, for T.T., in case of emergency. T.T. Thomas Thorne, my father. I sank into my chair, the journal in my lap, and began to read. It wasn't a diary of business dealings, but a log of a conscience. Decades of entries, detailing his guilt over my father's death, and his growing disillusionment with his own son. He wrote of his regret, of how he had allowed the lawyers to erase the Thorne name, and how that single act of expediency had haunted him his entire life. The final entry was dated just a week before his last stroke. Everett sees only the balance sheet. He does not understand that a legacy is a living thing. It must be tended. He will try to pave over the garden to build a parking lot. Frank is the only one left who remembers where the seeds were planted. This journal, and the key, are for him. He will know what to do. The charter for Sterling and Thorne is in safe deposit box 72 at the First National Bank, downtown. This key is the first step. My testimony in this journal is the second. Frank's integrity is the third. It was all there. The location, the proof, the moral justification. Alistair hadn't just left me a key. He had left me his confession. He had armed me, not just with a legal claim, but with the full weight of his own conscience. The panic I had heard in the shill bidder's voice at the auction would be nothing compared to the storm that was about to break over Everett Sterling's head. He thought he was liquidating assets. He was about to find out he was the one being liquidated. The immediate aftermath of acquiring the painting was a period of intense, quiet activity. While I had the journal and the key, Arthur preached caution. Possession of the tools is not the same as victory. Frank, he'd warned, his legal mind always seen 3 steps ahead. We must proceed like surgeons, not butchers. Every move must be precise, clean, and legally unimpeachable. Our first order of business was the safe deposit box. Arthur handled the preliminary contact with the bank. He discovered that the box was held in a trust established by Alistair decades ago, with a fascinatingly archaic activation clause. It could only be opened by a bearer of the physical key, in the presence of a legal representative of the Sterling estate, or upon presentation of Alistair's certified death certificate. Everett, in his haste, had likely not even bothered to check for such old forgotten accounts. His father's death certificate was a public record. We had everything we needed. While Arthur made the arrangements, his network of informants began to paint a more detailed picture of the chaos unfolding within Sterling Consolidated. The news was delivered in hushed phone calls and encrypted emails. The talent exodus had begun. It started as a trickle, then became a flood. It wasn't just the old guard, the executives Alistair had mentored. It was the crucial, mid-level managers, the senior engineers, the logistics experts, the people who actually made the company run. These were the people who, like me, had been loyal to Alistair's vision of stability and long-term growth. They saw Everett's slash-and-burn tactics not as unlocking value but as setting fire to the house to collect the insurance money. One of Arthur's key sources was a woman named Margaret, Alistair's longtime executive assistant who Everett had demoted to a glorified receptionist role. Margaret had seen it all. She reported that the mood in the executive suite was a toxic cocktail of panic and arrogance. Meetings were held for the sake of meetings. Buzzwords like synergies and disruptions were thrown around to mask a fundamental lack of understanding of the core business. Everett had replaced experienced department heads with young, hungry MBAs who knew how to build a spreadsheet but not a relationship. The institutional knowledge of Sterling Consolidated was walking out the door every single day, and Everett was too blind to see it. He just saw salary lines being cut from the budget, and he called it progress. It was the perfect illustration of a principle I'd come to understand deeply: competence isn't cheap until you lose it. The day we went to the bank was fittingly another gray and somber morning. Arthur and I, both in dark suits, looked like a pair of undertakers. We were met by the bank manager, a prim man who was clearly intrigued by the sudden activation of a decades-old dormant account. He led us down to the vault. The air grew cooler as we descended, the silence broken only by the click of his shoes on the marble floor and the final heavy clank of the vault door swinging open. He led us to a wall of burnished brass doors, box 72. I produced the key Alistair had left me. The manager used his own master key, then mine. There was a solid, satisfying thud as the lock disengaged. He pulled out a long metal box and placed it on a viewing table in a private room. Then he left us alone. My hands felt strangely steady as I lifted the lid. Inside, resting on aged yellowing paper, was a single thick document, bound in blue cardstock and tied with a faded ribbon. The cover was typed in an old-fashioned script: Founding Charter and Articles of Incorporation for Sterling and Thorne, LLC. I untied the ribbon. Arthur and I spread the document out on the table. It was beautiful. The paper was heavy, the ink was dark and clear, and the signatures at the bottom were unmistakable. Alistair Sterling, bold and sprawling, and Thomas Thorne, neat and precise. My father's hand. Next to them was the embossed raised seal of a notary public, dated over 50 years ago. Arthur read through the key clauses, his finger tracing the lines of text, his lips moving silently. I watched his face. His professional calm slowly gave way to an expression of pure, unadulterated awe. "It's ironclad, Frank," he finally breathed, looking up at me. "Absolutely ironclad." He pointed to a specific paragraph. Article 4, Section B. The founding partnership shares being 50% for Alistair Sterling and 50% for Thomas Thorne are declared perpetual and inalienable, to be passed to their respective legal heirs in their entirety. This ownership structure may not be diluted, altered or amended without the unanimous written consent of all holding parties from both founding families. It was a legal fortress. "And look at this," he said, his excitement growing. Article 7, the guiding principle of Sterling and Thorne shall be the creation of lasting value through innovation, stability, and prudent management. Any action by the board or executive leadership deemed to be speculative, reckless, or primarily for the purpose of short-term liquidation at the expense of long-term viability shall be considered a violation of this charter. There it was, the moral compass, the blade Alistair had hidden within the law. We had him. We had Everett on both counts. Not only was he not the sole owner, but his entire strategy as CEO was in direct violation of the company's founding document. The next step was to deploy the weapon. Arthur drafted a formal notice. It was a masterpiece of understated legal menace. It didn't make demands. It simply stated the facts that our client, Mr. Franklin Thorne, heir to Thomas Thorne, was the legal owner of 50% of the company's shares as per the original, binding charter, a copy of which was attached. It also noted that Mr. Thorne had grave concerns that the current management was in breach of Article 7, The notice was sent via courier to Everett's personal office and simultaneously to the lead partner at his new slick law firm. Then we waited. The explosion came less than 3 hours later. My phone, which had been silent for weeks, rang with a number I knew by heart. Everett Sterling's private line. I let it ring 4 times, then answered, my voice calm and neutral. Hello, Frank, what the hell is this? He was shouting, his voice tight with panic and rage. What kind of game are you playing? This is insane. It's a joke. I can assure you, Everett, it's no joke, I said, my tone even. This is forgery. It's fraud. I'll have you arrested. I'll sue you into the ground. You'll be ruined. The threats tumbled out, one after another, a cascade of impotent fury. My lawyer, Arthur Vance, has already authenticated the document, I replied coolly. I'm sure your own legal team will come to the same conclusion once they've had a moment to catch their breath. The charter is genuine. There was a sputtering sound on the other end of the line. He was realizing that threats weren't working. His tone shifted instantly from rage to a desperate, wheedling plea. Frank, listen to me. There's been a misunderstanding, a terrible misunderstanding. I was hasty. You were a valued employee. We can fix this. I'll double your severance, triple it. Name your price, Frank. Let's be reasonable. We can make this all go away. Name my price. The same man who had tossed a 2-week severance package at me like a bone to a dog was now asking me to name my price. The sheer naked hypocrisy of it was staggering. Value isn't always on the balance sheet, I thought. The time for negotiating my severance has passed, Everett, I said, letting a sliver of ice enter my voice. My price is 50%. It always has been. I'm not interested in making this go away. I'm interested in restoring the company to the principles upon which it was founded. I heard a sharp intake of breath. He finally understood. This wasn't about money. This was about power. I suggest you have your lawyers call Mr. Vance to arrange a meeting, I said calmly. We have a great deal to discuss about the future of our company. Before he could respond, I hung up. I disconnected the call, severing the line of communication, leaving him alone in his panic-stricken world. The power shift had begun. The servant had become the master, and the new king was about to find out that his castle was built on sand. The meeting was set for a week later, in the main boardroom at the Sterling Consolidated headquarters, a room I had prepared for meetings hundreds of times, but had never once sat in as a principal. Arthur had insisted we meet on Everett's turf. Let him feel like he has the home field advantage, he'd advised. It will make his defeat all the more poignant. Walking through the doors of the company felt different this time. The receptionist, a new face I didn't recognize, looked up with a bored expression. Can I help you? Frank Thorne and Arthur Vance to see Mr. Sterling, I said. Her eyes widened slightly. My name, once unknown in the public-facing parts of the company, was now clearly the stuff of frantic, whispered legend in the back corridors. Without a word, she buzzed us through. The executive floor was hushed, but it was the strained, tense silence of a hospital waiting room, not the productive hum I remembered. We were shown into the boardroom. It was a vast, intimidating space, dominated by a single colossal table of polished granite. On one side sat Everett, flanked by a team of 4 lawyers from his high-priced firm. They all looked grim and exhausted. Everett himself looked like he hadn't slept in a week. His face was pale, his eyes were bloodshot, and the arrogant swagger was gone, replaced by a brittle defensive posture. Arthur and I took our seats on the opposite side of the table, just the two of us. The contrast was stark and intentional. They had an army of hired guns. We had the truth. The lead lawyer, a man with silver hair and a weary expression, cleared his throat. Gentlemen, he began, we have reviewed the document you provided. After extensive verification of the notary's records and forensic analysis of the paper and ink, we are forced to concede its authenticity. He said the word authentic, as if it tasted like poison. However, he continued, shifting into his attack, it is our position that this charter is an archaic, unenforceable relic. 50 years of established corporate practice, the issuance of public stock, Mr. Sterling's last will and testament, all of these supersede this historical curiosity. Arthur leaned forward, placing his hands on the table. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His quiet authority filled the room. "Counselor," he said, his tone one of weary disappointment, "you know as well as I do that a founding charter of this nature, specifically designed as perpetual and inalienable, is the bedrock of the entire corporate structure. It's not a suggestion, it's the Constitution. Your client's father, Alistair Sterling, structured it this way for a reason. He made it a fortress. You can fire arrows at it all day, but you will not breach the walls." He then turned his gaze to Everett. "As for 50 years of practice, the charter was never violated while Alistair was alive. He ran the company, for all his faults, with a view to its long-term stability. You, Mr. Sterling, in a matter of months, have violated its core principles. Your reckless leveraging of assets, and your fire sale of the company's foundations are a direct breach of Article 7. We aren't just here to claim our 50% stake. We are here to save the company from its own CEO." The lawyers began to whisper furiously among themselves. They knew Arthur was right. They were just looking for a way to spin the defeat, to find a face-saving exit. It was then that I spoke for the first time, my voice cutting through their murmuring. I addressed Everett directly. "There will be no buyout, Everett. There will be no settlement that allows you to walk away. You will not be dissolving the company to take the cash. From this day forward, every decision, every expenditure, every hiring and firing, will require the approval of a 50% shareholder you did not know existed. Your reign is over." The color drained from Everett's face. He finally understood the nature of his trap. He wasn't just losing half his money, he was losing his autonomy. He was shackled to me. I laid out our terms, which Arthur had drafted. They were simple and non-negotiable. 1. The liquidation of all assets is to cease immediately. 2. I, Frank Thorne, will be taking my father's seat on the board of directors, effective immediately. My title will be chairman. 3. Everett will be removed as CEO. The board, now jointly controlled, will appoint a new one. I already had someone in mind, the former CFO, a man of integrity and experience whom Everett had forced out. I had already spoken to him. He was ready to return. 4. A full, independent audit of the company's finances and all decisions made since Alistair's death will be conducted. Everett stared at me, his mouth opening and closing silently, like a fish gasping for air. He looked at his lawyers, pleading with his eyes for them to do something. They could only offer him shrugs of resignation. They had been outmaneuvered from the start. This was the new workplace reality. The arrogant MBA, who believed in nothing but numbers, was now a prisoner of a history he had tried to erase. He was still on paper a very wealthy man, but he was powerless. His greatest asset, the company his father and my father had built, was now a cage. He was chained to a partner who represented everything he disdained: loyalty, history, and a belief in foundations over facades. As the meeting concluded, his lawyers numbly agreeing to draft the necessary paperwork, I stood up. I walked around the table until I was standing right beside Everett's chair. He flinched as I approached. I leaned down slightly, my voice low so only he could hear. "You said you were streamlining," I said, my voice a quiet echo of his own words from that day in the study. "You were right. It was time for a change. You just profoundly misjudged who would be holding the knife." I didn't wait for a reply. I turned and walked out of the boardroom, Arthur at my side. I didn't look back. There was no triumph in my heart, no surge of adrenaline, just a deep, quiet and profound sense of balance restored. The debt was paid. The foundation was secure. The company butler had finally put the house in order. In the months that followed, the transformation of Sterling Consolidated was swift and decisive. Under the guidance of the rehired CFO, now the new CEO, we halted the fire sale and began the difficult work of rebuilding. We re-established lines of credit with banks that had been spooked by Everett's recklessness. We reached out to the key employees who had left, and one by one, many of them came back, drawn by the promise of a return to stability and respect. The company, which had been listing badly, slowly righted itself. It was a long, arduous process, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like we were building something again.
not just tearing it down. I took my role as chairman seriously. I wasn't involved in the day-to-day operations. That wasn't my expertise. My role, as I saw it, was to be the guardian of the legacy, the keeper of the company's soul. I was the living embodiment of Article 7, a constant reminder that our purpose is to create lasting value, not to chase fleeting profits. Everett remained a silent 50% partner. He was forced to watch as we undid his modernizations and reinvested in the very things he had tried to destroy. The quarterly dividend checks he received were, I imagined, the most bitter money he had ever earned. He was trapped in a golden cage of his own making, a passenger in a vehicle he was no longer allowed to drive. One crisp afternoon in the spring, I drove out to the small cemetery where my parents were buried. I had a small framed document with me. It was a piece of the new company letterhead, the first run printed after the board meeting. At the top, in elegant, understated type, were the words Sterling and Thorne. I placed the frame against my father's headstone, leaning it so the name was clear. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. The silence in that quiet country graveyard was peaceful, a silence of accounts settled and promises kept. It was a long way from the vacuum of silence I had felt in my car outside the estate gates. This was the silence of resolution, and that really brings me to the heart of this whole story. It's not just about an old painting or a hidden document. It's about a truth that people like Everett Sterling will never understand. They believe value is something you can quantify on a spreadsheet, a number in a bank account, a stock price on a ticker. They look at people, at loyalty, at decades of service, and they see nothing but an expense to be cut. They look at a company's history and see a burden to be shed. They think you're just a part of the furniture, a fixture in the background, easily replaced. They never stop to consider that you might not be the lamp in the corner. You might be the load-bearing wall. They never imagine that the quiet, unassuming person who gets the coffee, who manages the schedules, who knows where all the bodies are buried, metaphorically of course, is the one person holding the whole structure together. They forget that loyalty, when it's betrayed, can curdle into a formidable strategic resolve. Competence is the most valuable asset any company has, and it's the one asset that never appears on the balance sheet until it's gone. My story might seem extreme, a one-in-a-million shot, but the feeling at its core, that feeling of being underestimated, of being overlooked, of being erased by someone with more authority but less wisdom, that's a universal story. It happens in offices and factories and boardrooms every single day. People who build things are pushed aside by people who only know how to break them. But here's the moral I want you to take away. Never mistake your quiet competence for weakness. Never let their arrogance convince you that you are worthless. Your knowledge, your experience, your integrity, that is your true capital. And sometimes when you're pushed too far, you have to be willing to invest that capital in yourself. You have to be willing to become your own chairman of the board. Because in the end, true power isn't about the title on your door. It's about the value you create and the foundations you're willing to protect. Everett Sterling learned that lesson. He's got a lifetime to think about it every time he cashes one of my checks. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, ever felt like the undervalued veteran in the room, do me a favor. Like this video, leave a comment below, and share your own experience. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more stories about competence being rewarded and arrogance getting exactly what it deserves.